MARZUL, A Tale of Piracy, Part 1. On the New Year's Eve of 2016, China and Russia declared war on the US and Europe over tensions in South America, Africa, and the Middle East. Soon after that, the world seeped quickly into a dark chaos, and the people, preoccupied with surviving, lost track of time. Every person on the planet who could afford it had emigrated to Australia. These people had been sold on the lie that they could be protected by the island fortress of Australia, which had been built during the first years of global war on the shores of the island. Surrounded by one Pacific Ocean, Australia was covered with drones and ringed with advanced warships, built in the name of protecting time. The government started calling itself an empire, and the people were forced to believe that their duty was to protect time itself. The Australian economy became a war economy, obsessed with building the best weapons and selling them to China, Russia, and the US in the name of maintaining peace. Poor people were left to starve and die thoughtlessly to save time. World War III started out as civil wars all across the surface of the planet. The wealthy of the world bet on each outcome as if war were just a game. After years of this selfish greed, the war ended in a global nuclear catapult fight between the West and the East, with the Earth's flesh burned alive by man-made nuclear shells. The air soon became toxic and nature started to die. Famines all over the world were happening, while the people of Australia were encouraged to feel secure. The Australian Empire promoted its mission of peace by publicizing its global efforts on preserving life and peace. They created great inventories of every animal and plant on Earth. The citizens of this brand new empire often boasted that the secret to the longevity of this empire was protecting peace and playing a neutral part, while it reaped the profits of war far off. And the Australian people were forced to feel pride for being a part of those who put fuel on the burning fires of war in the name of peace. The ruling elites of every country had eventually felt confident enough to move to Australia in the name of their own safety, and they created a temporary global government in the ultimate hope of reuniting the world. But they had grown suspicious of each other over the years of war, and no longer had any trust for one another. They found themselves side by side with their own enemies. Those who had survived the World War in Australia had families that had been savagely murdered by Australian-manufactured weapons elsewhere, and were outraged to see how these elites had allowed this to happen to the world. The poor of Australia started demanding justice in violent bursts of rage, and the ruling elites tried to fight back against this internal battle at their own loss. Blood spilled in the mega city of Sydney and other major cities. And if it hadn't been for a lucky twist of fate, humanity would have self-destroyed itself into extinction. The Australian Empire offered a truce with its people, and in exchange the people were allowed to conduct trials. But by the time the trial dates came around, the ruling elites had once again corrupted government and overnight evicted into exile anyone who was accused of opposing the empire. The war had murdered over 7 billion people, and only a rough estimation of 200–300 million had survived. The majority of these people remained within the safety of the great fortress of Australia, while all oppositions were banished. Years went by and the planet became fertile again, with the exception of Asia and North America, which had been transformed into massive desert wastelands, toxic with nuclear waste. The rest of the planet remained intact except for mines and undetonated bombs which covered many parts. While the Empire of Australia became more and more internalized and obsessed with protection, the banished exiles of the Empire spread across the globe. Inside the Empire there were many luxuries reaped from years of war, while outside life was scarce and slowly regaining. Most of the land animals had died during the war, and only the fish and birds had been able to survive. But inside the Empire there were many land animals that had survived and been kept in the name of preservation. These animals became luxury items the people enslaved themselves to, with most of them having never seen one in their lives. Most of the elder generations had been starved to death in the name of preserving time, and the majority of people left alive were under the age of 18. Age had been commodified into a luxury, being forced to work 16 hours a day in the name of saving time. All citizens ever grew up knowing was work, work, work. and they also knew that if they didn't work, they risked getting exiled off to another continent. In around the year of 2063, a boy was born by the name of MARZUL. His father had died of fever during the extradition to South America. Little is known about MARZUL's birth, except that he was born during the voyage. The exiles had been locked up 3,000 at a time and shipped off in metallic containers to their destinations. MARZUL's mother was sold off into prostitution as soon as her feet set on the shores of a country once known as Chile. Her just-born baby was given to a Catholic orphanage to be cared for. All there was to be told about this baby on his travel certificate was that his name was MARZUL, and his parents had been forced into exile for distributing forbidden anarchist material within the Australian Empire. The orphanage quickly started referring to this child as it grew as MARZUL the anarchist dog. Everyone at the settlement was strictly Catholic and taught from birth that anarchism was the Antichrist. MARZUL was small for his age, and by 8 wondered if he would always stay a small midget, having never known what his parents looked like. He was always the subject of mockery at the end of every joke, and everyone despised him, for they feared him. The small trading post of Barnitas, where MARZUL lived out his youth, had been established under the rule of Emperor Rothschild of Australia as a release zone for exiles. Most of the Catholics there were rehabilitated Catholics and could only find work in the town if they vowed their faith to the Catholic Church. Barnitas was a big port full of fishing ships, with a beautiful Venetian-style architecture, courtesy of the emperor. MARZUL was given a proper education and taught to read by recitation instead of the King James Bible, re-edited by yours truly, Emperor Rothschild himself. He often sat alone looking at the ships in the harbor and dreaming, as well as wondering about his mother. There was no image of his mother in his mind, and this void brought him great sadness. MARZUL sometimes dreamed that his mother would pick him up one day after school, and she would bring him to a castle and feed him desserts from dawn till dusk. He never heard from his mother in all those years, and when he was 17, he left the orphanage at legal age and set out to start his own life. His first job was on board a privately owned boat, which was more of a floating palace than an old boat. The boat was owned by the richest man in the city, and MARZUL was given a job as a dishwasher. He worked very hard and worked his way up after a year to being a waiter and serving the master's dinner. One night, the daughter of the ship's owner, who was 3 years younger than MARZUL, noticed him waiting in his corner to serve any request asked from him. She could not keep her eyes off him, and for her it was love at first sight. After dinner, she asked her father if one of the waiters could help her back to her room, because she was not feeling good. Her father, seeing no waiter besides MARZUL of service, signaled him to come over to the table and explained to him the task at hand. MARZUL had not noticed on the way back to the room this girl's flirtations with him, as his mind was millions of miles away, and even such a thought would have been forbidden, since MARZUL was just an anarchist dog who would be murdered for trying. When MARZUL reached her room, he immediately said good night and started to walk away. The girl ordered him to stop and help her find the light to her room. She very well knew where it was. Inside, she asked him his name, to which he told her, and to which she added, "But don't you want to know my name?" MARZUL, trying only to be amicable, said he did. "My name is Katharina," she replied. As she turned on the light, she saw MARZUL's face, not far from hers, and she lunged out to kiss his lips. At first, MARZUL was very reluctant, but then he decided if he stopped she might scream and get him into just as much trouble. The next morning, MARZUL woke up very early and made his way out of Katharina's room back to the one he shared with 6 others. And the next few days, MARZUL spent worrying that she would tell her father, but she did not. The days rolled by, and MARZUL grew less nervous. Then one night, after 8 weeks had passed, MARZUL, the anarchist dog, was dragged out of his bed by his hair to Katharina's father, met with an automatic rifle. Katharina was crying in a corner, too ashamed to look up. MARZUL realized by now that he had impregnated Katharina. Her father furiously threatened that he would kill the bastard baby and its father. His daughter begged mercy of him while MARZUL was beaten by on-board security officers. 3 days later, after being held in the boat's freezer with no clothes, MARZUL was in a police station where his master had told the police that he had raped his daughter and demanded justice. MARZUL was booked and sentenced to 10 years in the worst prison in the world. The Isla del Muerte was a metallic fortress off the coast of Chile, where MARZUL had been told stories about how most people did not survive this prison. The father of Katharina had bribed the police and local judge, who was a good golfing buddy, to put MARZUL there under special circumstance, since the honor of his daughter could not be intact unless MARZUL was put away. MARZUL, having never had any mercy from any god or life itself, found himself once again on the way to another most dreaded place to live. Everything was pitch black during the voyage as MARZUL was forced from one metallic container through dark corridors to other containers. All he could hear were the sounds of yelling and footsteps drumming on the metallic floors and big metal doors closing and opening in front and behind him. They had covered his head with a black cloth and gagged him. Upon his arrival at the prison, the warden gave him a beating as a welcome party and then trashed him into a cell, as if he were a murdered, bloodied animal nobody had need for. He spent months confined to the solitude of his prison room with nobody visiting him, not even the guards to feed him. The first weeks he spent there, MARZUL spent listening to the military boots of the guards drumming each day their routines on the floor. It was his only entertainment. There were also many screams of pain from the other prisoners as they cried for their lives they had lost and no longer owned the keys of freedom to. Walls were black and covered with desperately scratched pleas for mercy. MARZUL knew he would find no mercy in that god-forsaken place. As the years passed, MARZUL grew his first beard and survived thanks to rats he caught as well as the water that dripped into his window. If he was lucky, he caught a bird which he had to eat raw just like the rats. The walls kept closing in on him, and every day he stepped a little closer towards the cliff of his own insanity. He invented imaginary friends in his mind to keep him occupied, but his mind was drifting into darkness. The voices and sounds in this huge metallic torture island kept coming back to haunt his innocent soul. One day a prison guard opened his cell and in was thrown a new arrival, almost another beaten to death bloodied animal who had survived the festivities of the warden's welcome party. This prisoner was a female, although MARZUL could not tell at first. MARZUL had adapted to seeing quite well in the darkness, since for years he had only had a 30-minute glimpse of sun or sunny afternoons from inside the bottom of his prison cell, beamed into the entrance corner. After standing back for hours and observing his new companion, he finally found the courage to come and offer his aid. He put her to rest on the pile of human hairs which had grown over the years for constant human occupation. This female slept for 3 days while MARZUL took care of cleaning her flesh wounds from the beating and left her time to rest. He ripped apart his only shirt to bandage her wounds and spent his time staring at the first woman he had seen in years. The girl was about his age, and she had a certain beauty about her, even with all the cuts and bruises on her body. Prisoners were brought to this prison with the expectation that they would die there, so having mixed prison cells wasn't so uncommon at Isla de la Muerte. This made MARZUL cry when he realized that he should have been dead a long time ago. If it hadn't been for some strange will which kept him fighting to stay alive, he would probably have let himself die. Some innate courage had driven him, and now he felt it had rewarded him with some company. Her name was Cythera, and she was very thankful for the kindness MARZUL had shown her when she awoke, upon seeing her covered wounds. She explained that she was the granddaughter of a great pirate, who had survived in the Philippines during World War III by hijacking supply ships, which had been used to send supplies to the sections the Australian Empire defended. Cythera explained to him that she came from a feared family of pirates and that she had already sailed around the world twice in her life. This dazzled MARZUL, who had always dreamed in the harbor he grew up in of one day sailing off on a ship around the world. She had many stories to tell, and MARZUL enjoyed them all. Cythera was very confident that these pirates would come and save her, since she was absolutely convinced that she was very important amongst her people. MARZUL did not believe her, since he had been beaten inside and out, and had no hope remaining for the world, or his life, to linger on to. But he kept these thoughts to himself because he refused to plague his joy-bringing company's mind with unpleasantries, too eager to help her since it improved his own state of mind. One night, however, to Marzul's surprise, the pirates did come, as Cythera had told Marzul time and time again. It had been after a few months, and both prisoners had started to lose whatever hope remained. The distant noises had woken up Marzul during the night, because he had always been a shallow sleeper. There were cries of pain heard in the long reverberating metallic corridors of the prison. Marzul could hear the guards' voices screaming in pain as they were slaughtered and gutted by some unknown force. Then a loud voice kept saying, "Cythera!" Cythera jumped when she heard this, and ran to the people in the door to cry out, "Is that you, Manuel?" Shouts of joy were then heard from far off in the prison, as voices raced towards Cythera. Marzul then heard them attempting to open the door. Finally, after much barbarous banging and shooting at the door, 3 bearded men burst in the doorway. One of them immediately grabbed Cythera in joy, while the other 2 pointed their weapons in Marzul's direction in a very menacing manner. These men were strangely dressed in rags covered with gold and jeweled trinkets. They had metal teeth and smelled very strongly of alcohol. Marzul was brought on board their ship and given his freedom, and for the first time he was able to see the moon on the outside of the prison, after he had been updated that he had been in there for over 5 years. As their ship sailed off into the night towards the west, Marzul looked off into the distance and watched the prison disappear below the horizon. He was offered much alcohol and drink, while being congratulated and celebrated for taking care of Cythera. These pirates had many drunken songs to sing, and as they sang and danced before a big fire in the front of the ship, Marzul watched in amusement his newfound friends. Soon after the prison break, the Australian Empire, under order of Emperor Rothschild, declared the act was terrorism. Every HD TV and smartphone in the Empire was talking about the event and declaring that these terrorists should be punished. The Empire's navy sent out a flock of warships to go after the culprits, and wanted signs with faces of the pirates had been posted almost everywhere. The citizens in all major cities of the Empire were recorded going out into the streets to parade and burn mock statues of these enemies, and the Emperor vowed that all pirates would be brought to justice for their terrorist acts. Marzul's pirate ship was a big metallic ship made from the remains of warships used during the war. It resembled the classic pirate ship, except it was entirely made of metal and 8 times the size of an ancient pirate ship. There were 4 levels of cannons pointed on all sides of the ship, and a crew of around 80. The sides of the ship were banged up with battle scars, but the insides were filled with luxuries the pirates had gained during their excursions. Long corridors of tents with silk pillows and carpets to sit on filled the big rooms of the ship. Marzul was given a room below on the 3rd deck, which had a tiny balcony he shared with his next-door room, which was empty. The ship had more than enough room for the entire crew, and there was a lot of unused space. He did not know where the boat he was on would be headed, but he did not care. Never had he seen or known such freedom. It was his childhood dream which had come true. He tried to forget about the prison he had just spent years in, but it came back to haunt him in dreams. He had nightmares of being back in his cell, hoping to die soon. The first nights there on board the pirate vessel, Marzul had kept to himself in his room. Outside of his room there was a big table with food he was told he could help himself to. After a few days of being completely ignored by the crew, Marzul eventually came out of his shell and started taking walks around the ship. There were many levels with beautiful staircases in between them, with old paintings and photographs covering the walls. Everything inside the ship was covered with clean soft cloth, while the outsides of the ship looked beat up and dirty. On the 5th day he found a room on the 4th deck, which he had been drawn to because he heard laughter. In this room he found 20 or so members of the crew all laying down on pillows with pipes. One of the pirates by the name of Longbeard told Marzul to come sit down next to him and talk. Marzul, happy with the invitation, walked over the half-sleeping bodies to where Longbeard was resting. Marzul asked what they were doing, to which Longbeard explained that they were in the smoking room, where the crew smoked herbs to relax. He offered Marzul to try by smoking from his pipe. Longbeard watched as Marzul took 3 big inward puffs from the massive pipe. At first Marzul started to feel dizzy, having never smoked anything before in his life. He felt a soft cloud of comfort taking over his body as it sank deep into the pillows below him. A soft yet familiar voice woke Marzul up from his deep dream state. It was Cythera asking, if he wanted to go outside on top deck for a walk to have some fresh air. MARZUL found it very hard to leave the comfort of his pillows. He was told it was 4 in the morning and everyone had gone to sleep. After several attempts, he got up and followed her up the grand staircase to the top deck. They talked until the sunrise, until the stars and the full moon. Cythera explained that the ship was headed towards the Bahamas because they had no choice, and that the Australian Empire would most certainly not follow them to the other side of Cape Horn. After several weeks of pipe smoking with Longbeard and his friends, they arrived to a beautiful island. MARZUL had never seen anything like it. The waters were turquoise blue and filled with fish he could see swimming alongside the ship, and the sands on the beaches were whiter than any beach he had seen before. The captain of the ship declared a ceremony, where the crew named the island New Eden. MARZUL volunteered to be part of the first members to go on to the island, and he helped board the safety boats with materials for the night. They spent the afternoon building shelters for the night and set camp next to a beautiful little creek by the bay. There were around 30 women on board the ship, and it seemed to MARZUL's horror that the pirates shared them. During the voyage, MARZUL had seen Cythera kissing at least 3 men. This, each time it happened, led to a jealous fit of rage, MARZUL contained by smoking more pipe herbs Longbeard had prepared for him and encouraged him to smoke. Longbeard had noticed how MARZUL looked at Cythera with eyes of first love, and had also noticed the suppressed thoughts MARZUL had been having. He told MARZUL not to worry, that he was still young, and then when he grew to be an older pirate, he would have dozens of younger women throwing jealous fits of rage because of him kissing other women. He explained that this was part of human attraction, and by frustrating himself with it, it might drive MARZUL mad. Longbeard explained to comfort MARZUL's uneasy mind that there would always be more people in the world searching for love than in love, and that the odds were in MARZUL's favor if that was what he wanted. They lived on the island for 3 years, waiting for things to calm down in the Empire, and hoping their crimes would soon be forgotten. However, that was not the case. The Emperor had gone on an anti-pirate crusade. Thousands of pirates were massacred in the Pacific as the rest tried to escape. Some of them made it to New Eden, and brought with them many sad tales about the dark times which were happening in the West to their fellow people. In those 3 years they built a town which attracted sailing ships passing by. But since they were so far away from the Empire had been happy to conquer the Pacific with bloodshed in their name. New Eden became a haven for pirates while the Australian Empire was busy conquering the Pacific. The Bahamas had become a very organized set of pirate communities, and MARZUL had been promoted to mayor of New Eden by the captain of the vessel he had arrived on. MARZUL had spent those years becoming an anarchist and reading everything ever wrote upon the subject. Many books had been brought to him or found and collected over the years, and MARZUL was happy to read every one of them and print them so that everyone could read them as well. Some of them even reached the Empire. He had become a people's man and used their rage to set fires in the imaginations of the Empire. The pirates loathed the Empire, and so it wasn't hard for MARZUL to start convincing them that the Empire was evil as well as all that it stood for. Anarchism had been completely mass murdered during World War III, with the Australian Empire setting many campaigns after to destroy them, and what MARZUL had been doing was creating a revival of anarchism in the Atlantic Ocean the Empire did not want. The pirates being pirates did not pose a threat to the Empire, so the Empire thought at first. Since they had very little insider information on pirates being very antisocial and hard to infiltrate, it was difficult to study them. The Empire only saw these people as exiles, not newborn anarchists, so they didn't really try. MARZUL therefore had all of the freedom in the world to do as he pleased, and so did the people around Eden. New Eden City had been practically built overnight. It counted over 80,000 people now. The streets were built with the Empire's stolen marble, and the street lamps were made with stolen crystals. But underneath the town was where all of the interesting things happened. Underneath the streets of New Eden City, there were underground palaces welcome to all. And the pirates loved their pipe smoking, drinking, and lots of carpets and pillows under indoor tents of silk. There were many tales to be told about what happened there, and many people to tell them. MARZUL often told people that he did not believe in mayorship, so he often gave his municipal powers to the people, without ever interfering. He eventually proceeded to removing mayorship from the city and installed an anarchist community on New Eden, with nobody in charge and for the prosperity of all. The area had greatly thrived over the years with this, and so New Eden attracted many people. The news had eventually started to circulate within the empire, and Emperor Rothschild was not pleased when he was given his daily updates about the place. The emperor decided to send a fleet to go to the Bahamas and attack New Eden, but by then the people of that region had become so well organized that the emperor's fleet never reached New Eden. Instead, they had all drowned long before. New Eden responded by hijacking more freight ships owned by the empire, and MARZUL's people continued to grow wealthy, as well as well armed and protected with stolen property of the emperor from all corners of the earth. New Eden's image of freedom was crushing that of the empire's, and the empire was forced to go on censorship campaigns once again, declaring any anarchist a terrorist to the empire. There was even talk of sending a nuclear bomb to blow up the Bahamas region in which the pirates were on. Nuclear bombs had been prohibited after World War III, and yet the empire was playing with the idea. Instead, they set a massive army of warships and fighter jets, which created another war. Pirates were forced to leave the area on their ships, some of them going to South America, others Africa. MARZUL barely escaped Madagascar on his own ship, the Burmese Ruby. He owned a fleet of 5 ships in total, in which he brought all the remaining wealth that he had been able to save from New Eden. Then he made the voyage past the tip of South Africa on a ship with around 40 other pirates. Cythera had left during the confusion of war with other members to South America, and MARZUL did not know if he would ever see her again. They had become good friends over the years, and he would miss her. He would also miss the beautiful island of New Eden, with its glowing turquoise beaches, and the underground city of New Eden, which he would probably never see again. The pirates set up their new base on an island off the coast of Madagascar. MARZUL left the pirates with all the wealth they had salvaged from New Eden, and asked them to share it. He asked them to carry on with the anarchist values which had made New Eden such a thriving paradise, and took one ship which he used to sail to the shores of India. In India, he smuggled himself on a luxury cruiser bound for Australia. His plan was to sneak into Australia and into the empire, to see if he might be able to find traces of his past. There was an empty room in the cargo hold of the luxury cruiser MARZUL had been able to sneak into, and there was plenty of food as well as contraband materials aboard. But what he had most of all was the big bag of green plants the pirates smoked back in MARZUL's early days of discovering piracy. The plant itself was cannabis, which the pirates laced with opium powder they made by mixing pollen with the opiate. It took 8 days to reach Australia, and MARZUL had the time of his life in the deep dark corner of the cargo hold, with plenty of smoke puffs to keep his mind in a dreamy state. He had no particular plan or plot for his journey, and he was learning as he went, just as he had always done in life. And he had several occasions to sneak up onto the upper decks, avoiding the crew to feed and supply himself. He was almost used to the dark. He had lived there for years. The cruiser docked early one morning, and MARZUL slowly made his way to the top deck, making sure nobody could catch or find the unknown intruder. He stole clothes and packed a bag full of anything valuable he could find, or use to identify himself in case he was discovered. In the main bedroom, he snuck in on the passenger, still sleeping very deeply. Inside, he found one of the sleeping passengers' wallets. He went and found a mirror, combed his hair in the same fashion as the ID in the wallet, put on some of the clothes he had found, a pair of sunglasses, and walked off the boat as if he owned it. It was a private harbor, so there was no supervision. The crew had left to get supplies, and he walked out of the port area in the early morning. On his way into Sydney, he made sure to stay off the main roads and not run into any authorities. In New Eden, he had been told that Australia had become seemingly moneyless. Money was described through credit carried inside an RFID chip in his wrist. Therefore, MARZUL had to be extremely careful and was quite limited as there were many checkpoints all around the city. His advantage was that he didn't have a chip or a record, and therefore would not be recognized by any scanner. Back on the island of death, where MARZUL had been imprisoned, there had been no need to put a chip inside the inmates' wrists, because they were all supposed to die there. So MARZUL climbed on the back of a truck headed towards the city, hoping no one would search the vehicle. He remembered on the ride in that someone had told him about an anarchist refuge that exists below the city in the sewage and metro system. MARZUL could not, however, remember the name. He knew to look for a fountain near Park Street. He wasn't even sure the place still existed after all these years of persecution. When MARZUL finally got to Park Street, he couldn't see a fountain, but walked towards a big boarded-up structure near the center of the square. There were planks of wood all over with caution signs, warning of danger. He waited on a bench until the late night and then started to remove all of the wooden planks, trying to make the least noise possible. After nearly an hour trying to wiggle big planks of wood loose from the nails and staples with years of flowers, concerts, and shows on them, he finally was able to get inside the planked wood structure that was covering some sort of cement structure. MARZUL took out a flashlight he had stolen from the boat and discovered that the structure was in fact a fountain. He looked for a sewage entrance on the sides of the fountain and suddenly saw it. Inside the bowl of the fountain was a sewage drain. MARZUL had been told that under there was the entrance to the old anarchist underground city, which had been destroyed to stop any attempts to destroy the Rothschild-owned Empire of Australia. MARZUL climbed down into the sewage drain. It was an endless set of ladders going hundreds of feet down below the ground. The ladders seemed to go on forever, and MARZUL did not dare look down. He concentrated each step as to not lose his grip or step and fall down deep into the abyss. His foot finally touched a flat surface, and slowly he turned to look around him. He was in a big room with 3 different tunnels. There were many graffitis on the wall, and he did not know which way to go. The environment down at this level was cool and dry. MARZUL's arms and legs were so tired from the climbing down, as well as the traveling, that he sat down and lit his pipe to contemplate what he should do next. As he observed the graffitis more closely, he noticed that they were paintings with many symbolisms only an anarchist might be able to understand. He started to imagine that maybe they were a code that might help him to reach the underground city he was searching for, and still wondered if it was a myth. After several long minutes of thinking, he picked up a can of spray paint he found on one of the entrances and decided to start exploring the tunnels while using the spray can to mark where he had gone. He soon realized this system was a vast labyrinth, and this task would be harder than he had first imagined. There were many levels which led to empty rooms with walls covered in graffiti markings, ladders, underground rivers, and old trash left by people years ago. Then he noticed a pattern in the anarchist A's inscribed on the walls, and that they were all pointed in the opposite direction he was going. So he started to follow the direction they were pointing, in hopes he might find what he was searching for. The symbols led him to a big underground man-made waterfall where the A stopped. It seemed that the room had no exits and that it led him nowhere. He was getting ready to leave when he saw a white spray-painted A behind a waterfall with a glint of his flashlight. As he turned around to walk back the other way he had come, he made his way on the side of the waterfall pool below, making his way around, hugging the walls to not fall into the fast-running whirlpool directly below him, which was being sucked down like a toilet into a big hole at the bottom. Under the waterfall there was a door below the anarchist A. He turned the hinge, and in he walked into a massive room with a miniature city inside. The streets were all abandoned, as MARZUL made his way around in them. It was as if the city had been abandoned completely, with many signs of resistance, seemingly like a war had been waged down there, and that those that occupied it had lost and been forced back to the surface. But surprisingly, everything was intact. He even found a generator where there were many switches. He played with the switches until one of the generators turned on. Suddenly there was a bright light which blinded MARZUL's eyesight, with light as powerful as day filling the streets. Clouds and blue skies had been painted on the walls to make it look as though it were outdoors, with scenery on the walls to make the city seem as if it were on a mountain top overlooking several valleys. On one of the generator room's desks he found a newspaper. The name of the paper was Sydney Underground Times, and it was a newspaper about the city. MARZUL realized that they even had their own newspaper, so he browsed the city for as many clues as he could by reading the newspapers he could find. He discovered that the city had a population of nearly 20,000 before it had been invaded. Apparently the inhabitants had been able to resist for years, because there were many publications describing in great detail the attempts by the Empire to destroy this haven for anarchists. While browsing around in the underground city's library, MARZUL found a medium-sized black book under a large pile of newspapers and other old publications covered in years of neglect and dust. The book had caught his eyes because on the side in bold gold-printed large letters it read "Anarcadia, a History of Anarchism by John McCarthy," and it had a big silver anarchist symbol in the middle. The book was fairly used but still readable. He went to a comfortable couch in the corner of the room, wiped off the dust from it, and laid down. He reached inside his jacket pocket for his pipe weed, and started to read with the flashlight on his forehead, surrounded by darkness and solitude of the underground city. The book started out by explaining the history of anarchism, and it explained how the word came from ancient Greek and meant simply the absence of hierarchy. Then the book traced back thousands of years to the first people whom the book called the Simoneti, and these people were some of the first humans who had left from Africa to Madagascar. And then the book went on to explain that anarchism had influenced some of the world's first leading figures, such as Jesus, the cynics of Greece, Buddha, and Confucius. There were many others, but MARZUL skipped them and continued on. There had been two global anarchist revolutions at the start of the 1900s and 2000s, which had been completely ignored and censored by the hierarchies of the time, who had secretly slaughtered over 40 million anarchists during and in between World War I and World War II, blaming these wars on religious differences, instead of the scientifically determining them as class inequality divisions with anarchistic tendencies. The Rothschilds and other international banking dynasties, backed by the City of London Corporation, had funded all sides of World War I, World War II, and World War III for the selfish, gluttonous desire of enslaving the entire global population for the rest of human history. It also said that these international banking dynasties had supported starving to death over 54 million people every 5 years for corporate profit increases. MARZUL checked the front of the book and saw that it had been written in 2016, days before the World War was declared, and was a cry and declaration explaining that World War III had been started to mass murder anarchists who had only tried to liberate poor people once again. It denounced Jeff Rothschild as one of the main enforcers of this global genocide, and went on to explaining how anarchists tried to stop Jeff Rothschild from leaving to Australia with his British, Chinese, Russian, American, German, and Swiss traitor friends. MARZUL recalled to himself, learning back at the Catholic house, that Jeff Rothschild had been declared the first Emperor of Australia by the Sea Shepherd Conservation Society in the name of saving the planet from destruction. MARZUL awoke with his pipe in one hand and the book in the other in total darkness. At first he was startled by the feeling of objects in his hands, but then he came to and realized where he was and calmed down. His flashlight battery had died, but he had found his lighter in his pocket, broke off a piece of a curtain, a leg from a chair, and made himself a torch. His flashlight battery had died while he was sleeping, and the lights of the city had turned off. MARZUL figured that the city lights were probably on a set timer to simulate daylight. It felt like time for him to leave anyways, and he was getting anxious to get out of Australia without getting caught. Before leaving, he turned off all the switches and made sure that there was no trace of him left behind. When he came back out onto Park Street, it was late at night the next day, since he had crawled down into the sewage system the night before. MARZUL had brought the History of Anarchism book with him, and his plan was to smuggle it out of Australia before the Rothschilds could get their hands on it. The rest of the night he smuggled himself and the book back over the checkpoints leading to the port. Each checkpoint was surrounded by patrolling drones programmed to shoot at anything living that moved, but the drones had a red light on them which made them easily detectable at night. So MARZUL waited an hour at each checkpoint to make sure he had the drone's patrolling patterns down. On the last checkpoint he was almost caught by a drone coming near him, but jumped into a canal which was heading towards the ocean just in time. The book was in a plastic trash bag with all of his belongings, and luckily it had enough air in it to keep the bag floating on top of the water. He had also closed the bag with 3 knots just to be sure. Back in the harbor, MARZUL had found the same boat he had come in on. It was still in the harbor, but on the other side. In order to get there and not be seen, he made his way, swimming towards the boat, hiding his head behind the plastic bag as to not be seen by anyone. There was a lot of trash in the water in and around the harbor, and big ships inside the harbor to hide him, so his camouflage worked splendidly. He climbed up the ropes which were holding the ship to the port, and stealthily made his way around the ship. There was no sign of any crew or any passengers, so MARZUL decided to go to see if he might hijack the ship. He turned on the motor and saw that it had a full tank. MARZUL darted back down the ship, where he got off the boat and undocked it. 3 of the ship's crew yelled at him from a distance, where they were making their way back towards the ship to be there to welcome the passengers, when they would arrive. They started to run towards the ship, yelling for help. MARZUL ran back up the ship and made the boat engines move in reverse. It was a very fast boat, and when he slammed the boat into full reverse, it gave such a jolt that he almost flew over the steering wheel and out the front window of the ship. His nose broke from the amazing blow against the thick window, almost losing consciousness, blood running down his nose and pain settling in. Then he turned the boat around and set the boat at full speed towards the South American coastline. Luckily, the boat had been fully energized before his arrival and was full of energy. MARZUL at the time did not know it, but the boat was so fast that within an hour he had taken away all chances for the border patrol to catch him. He calculated the boat would last 3 days at full speed, and that it was equipped with a special solar roof that could keep the boat going months, but at 1/3 the speed. Now fully equipped with a modern ship of the highest caliber, MARZUL changed directions and started to head towards North America. He knew that North America had been hit the worst by World War III along with Asia, but he had heard rumors that North Canada and Alaska had not been affected as much. MARZUL knew that the Empire would come looking for him. Nobody steals a very expensive ship from the rich of Australia and gets away with it. So he knew he had to go somewhere where nobody would find him. After night had fallen, MARZUL was exhausted. He had been up all day, looking over his shoulder to see if they were following him. He put the boat on autopilot, headed down below to make the inventory and see if there was anything he could use or that would be useful. The boat was quite big and luxurious. MARZUL had spent all of his time in the hold of the ship, so he had not been able to appreciate it. MARZUL had a certain disregard for luxury anyways. He could live better than any king with his pipe, good food, and a comfortable soft place to sleep. It didn't matter if it was covered in expensive leather or cheap cloth, it was all the same to him. MARZUL left the captain's deck and went down the stairs towards the boat's living room. He crashed down on the couch and fell into a deep sleep. When he woke up, he saw there was a media center and turned on the screen. For the first time since he had been a child, he was watching Sydney's Rothschild 36 news channel. He stared in disbelief as cameramen followed behind soldiers killing pirate runaways of New Eden left and right. The Rothschild Empire were declaring them anarchist terrorists while hunting them down and murdering them like stray dogs. Then the news changed subjects, and he recognized the hazy picture of the boat he was sailing in on the screen. They were following the boat by satellite. MARZUL, being the rebellious type that he was, tore a piece of black cloth from a shirt he found in one of the bedroom closets and used white tape he had remembered seeing inside the boat's steering room. He made an anarchist A symbol on it and went outside to hang it on one of the boat's antennas. The ocean was clear and the sky was blue, with no boats or land anywhere in sight. As MARZUL went back inside, he saw the satellite feed adding the black flag to the image. As soon as the channel had figured out what it was, the image feed was shut off and the news channel went to commercial. For the rest of the day, the channel pretended as though it had never happened, showing pictures of before he had hung up the black flag. It took several days to make it up to seas the Rothschild Empire would not cross because of the distance. He figured it would take them days to get a landing strip anywhere near where he was, so he had nothing to fear. The boat was filled with food and every single luxury imaginable. The boat must have been stocked for another trip before he stole it. In a drawer hidden under a few clothes in the bedroom, he found a big stash of pirate weed and powders. Some of the pirates had used those powders, and so MARZUL curiously decided to try. First, however, he took out his pipe and smoked a bowl of pirate weed. Then he made himself a line of powder as he had seen other pirates do. The powder was extremely white, and unlike the beige and black colored powders he had seen other pirates use to sedate themselves, this one made him feel very full of energy. He started to feel very hyper and agitated, as well as extremely bored and happy at the same time. MARZUL found out that he had a very hard time stopping doing lines of white powder as well. It was as if his nose craved it. After 3 days of powder snorting and his nose bleeding, he had finished the powder. He went back to his smoking pirate weed and doing some of the black powder. This sedated him very deeply. He even tried smoking the black powder, which sedated him very deeply. He even tried smoking the black powder, which sedated him even more, he found. After several weeks, he made it to the shores of Alaska, traveling at half speed on solar energy, completely stoned out of his mind. The boat had a big screen in the steering room, which was connected to a satellite and gave him his location as well as other information. MARZUL was looking for a small harbor where he would be undetected upstream up the mouth of where a river dumped out into the ocean. Eventually he found what he was searching for. Luckily it was the beginning of summer, and being so far up north wasn't nearly as bad as he had thought. There was a steady sun as he went up the river looking for the ideal cove he had found. He docked the boat next to a very big rock near the entrance of the cove, which was covered by big trees with long extending branches, so that he would not be seen by any satellite, drone, or airplane. MARZUL fully charged the boat before he went into the hiding space, and he knew he could last weeks on the energy without exposing the position of his stolen boat.